All right, so again, you can see this is the proportion of whites to slaves to free blacks. The basic rule of thumb here is the more south you go, the less likely you are to see free blacks, and the more likely you are to see slaves. And you see certain states like South Carolina where slaves actually outnumber the white people. Now, to be sure, on every plantation, black people outnumbered white people, but only in certain states. South Carolina, Mississippi, did slaves actually outnumber black people, actually outnumber white people. Looking at the notes, Africans brought to the mainland colonies in the 18th century were very diverse, coming from different African cultures with different languages and religions. For most of the 18th century, the majority of American slaves were born in Africa, and a truly African-American people with a cohesive culture shaped by African, European, and American influences emerged only very gradually through the common experience of slavery. The three different slave systems in British North America produced three distinct African-American cultures. In the Chesapeake, a healthy climate led to natural reproduction of the slave population, allowing for a balanced sex ratio that created family-centered slave communities. Continuously exposed to white culture, slaves here learned English and were influenced by religious revivalism, the Great Awakening. In South Carolina and Georgia, the harsh rice plantations created a very different culture. Their low birth rate led to continuous slave imports, and since slaves seldom encountered whites and had more autonomy, freedom, individual personal freedom, than those in other kinds of plantations, they were able to create a more African culture. They were outside the watchful eye more so than other slaves. In the northern colonies, where slaves were a small part of the population and dispersed as individuals or small groups throughout the white population, a distinctive African-American culture developed slowly. So, in this next image, you see slaves working the cotton gin. It is very difficult to understate the effect the cotton gin had on slavery. Slavery quadrupled from 1800 to 1860, from 1 to 4 million. Many Americans prior to the cotton gin had thought slavery was going to very slowly, gradually work its way out. Not after the cotton gin and not after the Louisiana Purchase. And this is what happened. Slavery moves from the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia to the deep south. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas. So looking at the notes here, the market revolution and westward expansion, which occurred simultaneously in the North and South, increased divisions between these sections. Perhaps the most dynamic characteristic of America's economy in the early 19th century was the birth of the Cotton Kingdom. The early Industrial Revolution in England was based in cotton textile factories, which demanded a huge amount of cotton. The Deep South was suited to growing cotton, and once Eli Whitney in 1793 invented the cotton gin, or got the patent for it, which quickly separated cotton from seeds, cotton production quickened, became very profitable, and spread. Whitney's invention, along with new western lands, Louisiana Purchase, and factory demand for cotton, the Lowell textile mills up north, as an example, revolutionized American slavery. Once expected to die out with tobacco, slavery was expanded by cotton, so Jefferson's Empire of Liberty had become, as you will see, an empire of slavery. When Congress outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, a massive internal slave trade in slaves grew in the U.S., in which slaves in the older slave states of Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina were sold via auction to the newer slave areas of the Deep South. Between 1800 and 1860, about 1 million slaves were sold and forcibly moved west in the internal slave trade, kind of like their own Trail of Tears. Though Jefferson imagined the West would secure the future of an American republic populated by independent small farmers, the Yankee vision, slave plantations producing cotton for export became the basis of the Empire of Liberty, or Empire of Slavery. Moving on. Alright, so that's kind of what happened. Cotton production increased and moved southwest. So if you look at the notes underneath, 1790 we had 700,000 slaves. 1810 we had 1.2 million. 1860 slaves were 1/3 of the southern population. They had tripled to 4 million. So even though cotton agriculture in some sense commercialized the South, it did not create a dynamic and diversified economy. It was all cash crops: rice, cotton, tobacco, indigo. Cotton plantations simply spread the agrarian, slave-based social order of the eastern states westward. The Cotton Kingdom remained rural, and the South's transportation and banking systems were underdeveloped arms of the plantation economy. Manufacturing and technological development here lagged, especially compared to the North. In the North, the market revolution and westward expansion spurred changes that transformed the region into an integrated economy of commercial farms and manufacturing cities. So the North was more diverse, more industrialized. Once isolated farmers, now connected to distant markets by new transportation routes and credit, sold more goods and acquired more cash, which they used to purchase more goods they once made at home. Western farmers sold their goods and found credit in growing eastern cities. You've heard this already. Credit allowed them to purchase land, fertilizers, and new agricultural machines, such as the steel plow and the reaper, which greatly increased agricultural productivity in goods such as wheat. That was not happening in the South, where cotton had become king. In 1800, it was 7% of our exports. By 1860, 57.5%. Moving on, the South's peculiar institution, the way that we euphemized slavery. Again, the auction block became omnipresent throughout the South. The Upper South selling off their slaves to the Deep South. And here you see an advertisement for a slave auction. All right, here you see an image of a slave auction. Sometimes the slaves would be in the nude, displaying them like animals. A very common sight in the South. All right, you see some slave accoutrements, things to kind of keep them in line. You see a slave muzzle, which have been featured in movies recently. Owners were known to brand their slaves like their cattle, the family crest or the family logo. See a nice heart on one of the families. All right, the notes. Though planters made more laws enhancing the power of masters over their slave property, violence, such as whipping, was at the center of the institution and its perpetuation. As slavery became entrenched, race became a more significant line of social division. Black skin became increasingly a mark of unfreedom. Whites more and more saw free blacks as dangerous and unwanted, and restricted the rights given earlier to free blacks, such as gun ownership and the vote, for free landowning black men. Because Virginia by law required freed slaves to leave the colony, free blacks remained a very small part of the population. Little known fact there. All right, so last slide, some more slave accoutrements. You see some slave leg irons to get them from running away, or if they were being transported via foot. You see a slave tag or a dog tag to identify who they were or who they belonged to, and a typical pair of slave shoes. All right, so be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.